So you have this large state, small state confluence. And then you have those in the middle for whom it is sometimes convenient to quote international law, for whom it is sometimes convenient to breach international law because there is no enforceability of a remedy against that breach. So look at how this whole complex comes about in a world where the equality of states, to come back to that now, is not really equal.
Good afternoon, everyone. I would like to welcome you to the Krasno Global Event Series. It is great to see that so many of you have joined us again by Zoom today. Today, our distinguished guest is Dr. Alexander Sceberras Trigona, one of the leading politicians in the Republic of Malta. Thank you for joining us today, Ambassador. How are you doing?
Hello. How are you, Klaus? Good to see you again. You're looking fine.
Thank you very much. Great to see you here too. I will introduce Dr. Sceberras Trigona to all of you in a minute. I'm Klaus Larres, and I'm the Richard M. Krasno Distinguished Professor of History and International Affairs at the University of North Carolina in Chapel Hill. And I'm also a Global Fellow at the Woodrow Wilson Center in Washington, D.C. Today, we are talking about how small states often manage to punch above their weight in global politics. We will talk about whether this is actually beneficial for a small state such as Malta and whether it is also advantageous to the international community. Our event today is entitled Punching Above Their Weight: How Small States Influence the Great Powers and Shape Global Politics. The conversation with our distinguished guest will be followed by Q&A from you, our Zoom audience. You are welcome to ask many written questions by using the chat function at the bottom of your Zoom screen. Our two Krasno assistants will select your questions and read them out to all of us. As always, we are videotaping the event today for our famous YouTube channel, on which the videos of all our events can be watched all over again once the session is finished. They are all worth watching, of course. The address is youtube.com/KrasnoUNC. We have a great Zoom audience today, and as I said, everyone is most welcome to submit your questions to our speaker today. Let me briefly introduce our distinguished expert today, Dr. Alexander Sceberras Trigona. Alexander is a former Foreign Minister of Malta. He was a parliamentarian and a representative of Malta to the World Trade Organization, and he has worked as a special envoy to 3 Prime Ministers of Malta. Dr. Sceberras Trigona also was a Rhodes Scholar in Oxford at the Oriel College, and he earned a doctorate in law at the University of Malta. He wrote his thesis on constitutional change and the Maltese constitution. As Foreign Minister from 1981 to 1987, Dr. Sceberras Trigona took the initiative to launch a series of Mediterranean Foreign Ministers' conferences for the non-aligned countries of the Mediterranean. He also managed to win Malta's first ever seat on the United Nations Security Council, and that was from 1983 to 1984. And above all, Dr. Sceberras Trigona negotiated Malta's neutrality agreements. Throughout his career, he has strenuously promoted the application of the UN's Charter Chapter 6, prioritizing the peaceful settlement of disputes before accepting the use of force under Chapter 7. The ambassador is thus strongly in favor of trying to use peace and to have peaceful solutions before resorting to war, if at all possible. Dr. Alexander Sceberras Trigona is a founder member of the Diplo Foundation, and already since 1991 he has been organizing courses simulating international negotiations at the Mediterranean Academy of Diplomatic Studies, which is part of the University of Malta, as well as for the Geneva Center for Security Policy, for the British Commonwealth, and also for the EU Commission in Brussels. I was fortunate to meet Dr. Sceberras Trigona at a recent conference in Japan, where we discussed neutrality in global politics. And it is a distinct honor to welcome you to the Krasno Global Event Series today, Ambassador. How are you doing?
Fine, thank you, Klaus, if I may call you Klaus over here.
Absolutely.
Because I recall our fantastic long walks after the conference in Kyoto, where we were discussing everything under the sun, from Woodrow Wilson's failed League of Nations participation for the US and what caused that, really, because those 14 points were so stimulating. And we are still at a crossroads whether to go for international governance and the rule of law, or where might is right. I think those crossroads are even more starkly in front of us today after the US missiles from Ukraine were hitting Russian territory. So let's see how that is going to escalate.
Thank you for joining us today, Alex. It's really a pleasure to have you here. And you already mentioned some of our problems we are facing in today's world. We seem to have gone back to a world which is dominated by great power competition. The US, China, Russia, and also perhaps the European Union and India, for instance, come to mind. Is there a role for small states, for small nations such as Malta, but also Cyprus, Switzerland, the Benelux states, Singapore, and many more? Can and should these countries have an influence in global affairs? And how are they surviving in a world dominated by the great powers?
Yes, I think you're right in posing this question with the point of the increasing dominance of the big powers and also some others. Because the dominance is a facet of the attempt of the United States to become unipolar after the end of the Cold War. Let us remember that the Cold War was buried in the waters of Malta when we had helped organize a meeting of Bush and Gorbachev to bury the Cold War here of the seas and the meetings on the ships. And goodness, what a tempest there was on that particular day. The meetings were nearly going to be called off. But what happened over there with the famous not an inch eastwards was that, like the end of the Second World War, we only had spheres of influence which were not defined. Historically, since the Treaty of Westphalia, we've had at the end of a war a clear treaty giving booty to this and territory to that, reparations to that. Perhaps this wasn't the best way forward, but at least we had a clear-cut understanding of how that war had ended. Now, with the spheres of influence decided in Yalta, and again, in Malta, we had Churchill and Roosevelt meeting for a whole week before they went to Yalta to meet Stalin. So again, look at how Malta, in its, how can I put it, it wasn't actually mediating because Malta was still a colony, but as a location, it lended itself to this. Now, I'm mentioning this unipolar moment at the end of the Cold War because this was converging precisely with the project for a new American century. However, what happened was that with Fukuyama saying this is the end of history by 2008, and therefore in 19 years, you have Robert Kagan coming out with the end of dreams, the return of history. So I think that is a milestone between 1989 with the end of the Cold War and the realization, even amongst academics in the US, that the return of history had again occurred and the unipolar moment was ending, squandered. It depends on your value judgment about its move away. Now, why am I using this point? Because now with President Trump, again, president of the US, are we getting back into the unipolar moment as his reign of office for 4 years ago seemed to indicate that he was pushing for make America great again? And therefore, is that what we should be expecting? Why am I saying this now? Because small states operate in a larger system, and it depends if the system is allowing leeway for them to operate. In a very, very tight pyramidal structure where you have unipolar, absolutely keeping everyone in line, there's hardly any space for small states. In a multipolar system, yes, then small states do enjoy a latitude to exert some influence, to answer your very precise and commendable question. And I will mention how when Malta was pushing in Helsinki in the famous CSCE, it used to be called Conference on Security and Cooperation in Europe then. It's only now become Organization for Cooperation and Security in Europe. But in those critical years between 71 and the conclusion of the Helsinki Final Act in 75, Malta was pushing above its weight, as the title of this program goes, to introduce the non-European Mediterranean states to contribute their perspective on European security. And it could do this on a very tight, narrow interpretation of the standing orders, of the procedural rules, the Blue Book, as it used to be called, by bringing in the representatives from all the Mediterranean littoral, which was not European. Our Prime Minister Dom Mintoff opened the space for other small states to come into this preponderantly USA, USSR, and fellow travelers to open up even the geographical space and the context. And we finally managed to introduce the Mediterranean document into the Helsinki Final Act. I did the same thing as Foreign Minister with Secretary of State Schultz and Foreign Minister Gromyko by grouping the neutral and non-aligned countries at the time in Europe, Sweden, Finland, Austria, Switzerland, Yugoslavia, Malta, and San Marino, together to act as brokers between the NATO parties and the Warsaw Pact parties. And in fact, there were ideas then to create a huge buffer zone in these neutral states, or coming down all the way from northern Finland right down to the Mediterranean. And that didn't take off, but it was also used in the discussions on military maneuvers, early notifications, confidence-building measures. So there is scope for small states to use their influence interstitially in the spaces that are allowed and create space.
Let me just stop you there. And how would you actually define a small state? Is it territory? Is it population? What is it?
Well, I'll tell you, there was a book which was quite pioneering in 1966, 67 by David Vital from Jerusalem. And he wrote on the inequality of states. So he started teasing the question of not all states are equal. But then it died out. There wasn't any literature on small states. After the US invasion of Grenada, in the Commonwealth where I was present, all we could do was to commission a report on the vulnerability of small states, and that is part of the Commonwealth archives in 1984-85. And there the first problem was exactly as you're saying, how are we going to define a small state? By geographical size, by GDP, by population, by military capability. And basically, we all agreed on a population of 1 to 1.5 million. And we had the Forum on Small States, which Singapore established in New York with the United Nations, which defined it as under 10 million. But I think that was pushing it a little bit too far. But then you start seeing how the question of size isn't quite right, because you have Qatar, which is a very rich country, much, much richer than all the other small states put together. Namibia, which is, again, a big state, but acting as a small state internationally, and going for regulatory diplomacy. That is where small states are very fond of pushing and promoting their own reliance on international law and the rule of law, because they want some kind of handle to compensate for the deficit of vulnerability. But large states want to be above the law. So you have these two conflicting factors where large states want to be above even the United Nations itself and the Charter and the international law. Small states really shrieking out that the laws have to be respected, pacta sunt servanda, treaties should be honored. So you have this large state, small state confluence. And then you have those in the middle, for whom it is sometimes convenient to quote international law, for whom it is sometimes convenient to breach international law because there is no enforceability of a remedy against that breach. So look at how this whole complex comes about in a world where the equality of states, to come back to that now, is not really equal. But isn't that the same in domestic societies? We are equal before the law, but are we really equal economically? Even in stature, I'm taller than you. So we are not equal in height. We are not equal in our salaries. We are not equal in the temperature of the climate where we live. So the equality concept is a chimera.
Yeah, thank you very much. I think in international relations, the great and the small powers decided on an official difference or the acceptance of an official difference since the Treaty of Chaumont in 1814. And since then, that has, of course, been implemented in reality as well. When you were representative of Malta in the international community, including foreign minister, but also world trade representative and so on, did you feel taken seriously by the great powers, or did you feel discriminated against being a representative of a rather small island nation?
It depended on what leverage I could muster. If I could find a lever in the standing orders and the procedure whereby a decision of that intergovernmental organization had to be by complete consensus and not by majority, then I could wield some leverage. If I could gather a group around me, then that could give us increased leverage. As I'm mentioning in the CSCE, we also did this in the Commonwealth with the small island developing countries, because the British Commonwealth has a majority of small states, small island states. Today, they've just released a declaration at COP29 that they're being abandoned, and they are rallying around something which is geographical. If sea level rises as it is these small island states that are going to be threatened. Their wherewithal is going to be threatened. Although Bangladesh, a large state by population, by size, will also be threatened because of its delta being sub-sea level. And so the sea will just rush in and push 4 million or more to move. So look at this small state paradigm. Also for the Maldives, for example, many of the beautiful islands, Paradise Islands, will be threatened, therefore threatening the economy of the Maldives also. So there are rallying points of small states which bring them together. I don't need to be just myself as Alex raising my hands to say, listen, procedurally, I want to push this particular point. There is a constituency of small states in the world if one can tap it.
Thank you. As foreign minister, you pushed the neutrality alignments of Malta. And
Not alignment.
yeah, Malta was a former British colony, and clearly Malta was seen as part of the West, as part of the British Commonwealth, as part of the Western world. So why did you feel that neutrality was essential for Malta rather than siding officially with the West, being part of the West and not being neutral?
Well, to start with, just for the record, we are still members of the British Commonwealth, and we have, in fact, hosted 2 Commonwealth heads of government meetings in Malta, which is quite a record. We had Queen Elizabeth II, God bless her soul, coming over here twice. Her last foreign visit was over here in 2015. So that shows that it's interesting for us as a small state to be in groups in order to be able to create least common denominator resolutions, which we can then use in larger fora. I think that is very, very important. But the physical obstruction of having military bases over here was too much. It wasn't helping us to be constitutionally independent for sure. As I presented in my paper in Kyoto, which you may feel free to circulate to your audience, it hindered our independence? No way. In fact, we were bandwagoning with the West rather blindly, and it even obstructed Malta's economic development. Malta is physically very, very small. It's just 100 square miles, And in the maps I had shown you in Kyoto, you could see nearly 20%, if not more, of Malta occupied by the British bases. So releasing 20% of territory for a small country like ours was a windfall, basically, that could be developed into either private housing or industrial parks or tourism, etc. So that is an idea of how important it was to close the military bases. Moreover, we did not want to be coagulating into one group or another. Now, obviously, there were those very right-wing journalists who were criticizing us because they were inspired by their masters, because they saw that Malta was leaving the West and potentially becoming communist. But I narrated to you, I remember, how when our prime minister applied to join the non-aligned movement, it was Fidel Castro who questioned our credentials by saying, you still have military bases. And our prime minister stood up very, very sprightly and told him, you have Guantanamo. In those days, Guantanamo was not even known. And he had to sit down. So you can see the type of discussion you get in the non-aligned movement. We close our bases. Cuba hasn't yet closed its bases, at least in the US. So there you have an idea that by joining the non-aligned movement, we could find out our way as it behoved us, as it fit our mainly economic development purpose. So there.
Would it have been possible to say goodbye to the British bases without becoming a neutral state, without joining the non-aligned movement?
Yes, of course, but this gave us much more of a status which carried credibility. First of all, there was a long 7-year period between 72 and 79, which Mintoff negotiated with Lord Carrington to close the bases in a tapering way, because we did not have the capability to push the British forces out of Malta. We did not want Malta to suffer the way that Cyprus suffered in its fight either for enosis with Greece in order to get rid of the British bases or for total independence. And about 700 British soldiers died in that fight over there because it became a physical fight. Ours was a much more diplomatic arrangement by arranging that each couple of months, so many buildings and territory would be released to the Maltese government, thus reducing slowly over 7 years till the very last warship left Malta in 79. And even then, I will admit and confess, we said, what if it just remains sitting there? What are we going to push it out of our harbors with? We did not have, we had little tugboats and patrol boats. And Margaret Thatcher, thankfully, only got elected a couple of months later in May, because who knows, she might have done a Falklands in Malta. It would have been easier for her forces to come here and remain here against all treaties. But then in the Treaty of Amiens, which Napoleon had concluded with Britain, the British were meant to evacuate Malta within 3 months from 1802. And they stayed here till 79. So that's quite a breach of international treaty. In fact, Napoleon is known to have stood up in the Assemblée Nationale in the Parliament in France and criticized perfidious Albion, because they were breaching international treaties. And he had Spain and the Batavian Republic on his side, and the United Kingdom was on the other side of that treaty between 1 and 3. But anyhow, this is of historical interest.
Thank you. Yeah, let me ask you, for example, Austria and Ireland are Western countries and they are both neutral and they haven't joined the non-aligned movement. Why did Malta think it would be advantageous to not just be neutral and be part of the West, as Malta clearly still is? As you mentioned, the British Commonwealth, of course, that's an indicator where Malta stands in international affairs. And Malta decided not just to be neutral, but also to join the non-aligned movement. Why was that seen as an advantage? And do you think it still is an advantage to Malta?
Yes. First of all, our neutrality, although it is in international treaties, was finally introduced into our constitution. We codified it, and it was entrenched with a 2/3 majority and not removable by a simple majority. But if there is, at one day in the future, a two-thirds majority in our parliament, it can be removed. So that is the extent of its tenacity, if you like. Unlike the neutrality which was in the Treaty of Amiens, because that is something that is very, very interesting. Article 10 of the old Treaty of Amiens is a third of the length of the whole treaty, describing how neutrality had to be observed in Malta. Now, to answer your question directly, the neutrality gives us more credibility internationally when we try to apply Chapter 6. Because just being an independent nation doesn't immediately make you an honest broker. And we've heard of honest brokers whose credentials are not 100%. So the neutrality, since it is entrenched as actively neutral, is meant to foster and promote peace during disputes. And we have brought together a number of disputing parties in Malta. Just last year, when the tensions between the US and China were at the highest, we brought Wang Yi, the Chinese foreign minister, and Jake Sullivan for the breakthrough meeting over here in Malta. So this is even more recent than Bush and Gorbachev in '89. So Malta's neutrality is what helps other countries from distant and perhaps opposing positions, policies. I wouldn't say ideologies too much these days. I think the ideological confrontation of the Cold War is a thing of the past. And anyway, Russia's economy is as big as Texas. So it's no longer the USSR and the USA neck to neck with an equal or nearly equal amount of ICBMs and etc. So last year's meeting in Malta, I think, is something to be hailed. And this is why even our operations, we are now for the second time in this length of the United Nations history in the Security Council, and also chair in office of the OSCE, of the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe. And it's going to be meeting in Malta in December. And it is meant to be hosting also Lavrov from Russia as a member of the OSCE. So look at that space. In fact, one quotes Nehru in having envisioned, his vision of non-alignment was a plague on both your houses. Let's restrain you to your own devices in your own territories and your own fellow travelers' territories. Do not expand onto the rest of the world. Let's keep the rest of the world free from your ideological confrontation. Let's create a space where people can live freely and not get caught up in outside ideologies. I think that sense is very inspiring. And that sense is brought over a number of different leaders, not only from Nehru, from Tito in Yugoslavia, that was his principle, from Olof Palme, who I used to discuss this with quite regularly, and this was his concept of creating space, physical space now, between the two superpowers and the pacts, because that would create an alternative possibility even for the members. And you remember, I'm sure, how de Gaulle used to try and create space within NATO, and Ceausescu used to try to create space within the Warsaw Pact, the little elbow room he could find, because he was under the discipline of his pact and de Gaulle under the discipline of NATO. So look at the possibilities for others outside these pacts not to be embroiled in others' wars. And that is why one of the principles of neutrality, and not merely independence, is to not have foreign military bases and foreign troops stationed in your territory, so that both sides can rest assured that they're not seeing this territory being used against them and therefore wanting to quash that foreign element in this territory. By saying hands off, I think that is salutary and commendable. And then from hands off, say, Malta, the idea when I was organizing the meetings of foreign ministers of the non-aligned in the Mediterranean was to have the hands of the Mediterranean, but that is still a dream.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. When talking about neutrality, we also have to talk about Ukraine, a very current question. Of course, the war in Ukraine is still waging, this terrible war. And the question of Ukrainian neutrality is highly controversial, with some people obviously being strongly in favor and an awful lot of people being very strongly against it, including the Ukrainian government itself. How do you see that? And Ukraine, of course, one also has to say, is not a small country, neither population nor territory-wise. So to compare Ukraine with Malta or Switzerland or Singapore would also not really be a good idea. But still, the idea about Ukrainian neutrality is playing a large role, at least in the discussion in academia and in part of the political world, while in reality, so far, it has played very little role. How do you see the whole complex?
It's very, very difficult to speak about Ukrainian neutrality at the moment when the war over there is getting hotter and hotter. There is no vision of a light at the end of the tunnel. I don't know what promoted Biden's grant of the US missiles. Some have said that it is to frustrate Trump's boast that he will close the Russian-Ukrainian war in 24 hours. But that's internal US politics. I don't know about Ukraine, whether we can evangelize neutrality, so to speak. I am not here as an evangelist for neutrality. I know it was good for our country. The Swiss also have some doubts and are passing some legislation at the moment which is denting their neutrality. Not the Austrians, who are very, very keen on it. The Irish have their own qualified definition, which is not codified completely as with ours. So there you have different understandings of neutrality. There isn't one size fits all. Then you have Costa Rica, you have Indonesia, which is teasing neutrality. You have a number of other countries. In Japan, when we were in Japan also, there are some thinkers and close to policymakers who are seeing that neutrality could be of benefit to Japan in its present condition between China, North Korea, and the US bases in Okinawa. So each side, each state tries to see whether the jacket fits or whether it needs a lot of alterations, or whether it doesn't fit at all and bandwagon. I think a rather interesting paper from Singapore Technical University distinguished between the old balancing and bandwagoning dilemma for states during the highest unipolar moment in 2003 by introducing a finer differentiation, by introducing the sense of buffering, 4 differentiated phases: buffering, beleaguering, binding, and bonding. So that's rather interesting to see how many more facets there are to this concept, which isn't a one size fits all. I think that is rather important to keep in mind. But what makes it so commendable, much more than mere independence, is the active neutrality sense, not the passive neutrality that you had of old. And the active neutrality compels a state like Malta to carry out brokerage. And I think we need our academics to come back, and I thank you for putting this in and introducing me at the very outset. We need our academics even to inquire, why was chapter 6 put before chapter 7? There isn't any divine 6 before 7. But there is a great inspiration not to go to war, not to kill people, not to waste economic treasure in this haphazard manner, and go for peace and find the peaceful ways of settling disputes. There will be disputes, inevitably. Even in a domestic society, there are disputes. Some are solved calmly, some are solved judicially, some are solved in a fisticuff and a murder or something criminal. So what we have in domestic society is also reflected in international society. But we need to reinforce much more chapter 6. We need to have much more mediation supported by the United Nations. We need to have conciliation much more, the negotiations much more. Why was it that Russia and the US and Russia and NATO did not get down to negotiations before the breach of international law in February of 2022? There was a a window between the November Nods Verbal and the move into Ukrainian territory. Why was that negotiation window not taken up? I think that is so important. Had we had a stronger push for negotiations, for mediation, for reconciliation, I think that could have saved the day. And we would not have had the disaster that has happened in Ukraine now, with so many people killed, so many people displaced, so much property crushed and broken down. And the same with Israel in Gaza and in Lebanon. There is hardly any brokerage. When we tried in the Security Council, we faced a veto a number of times, even for a mere ceasefire, let alone for negotiations and mediation. So this is the limit of how much a small state can do. If the big powers just want to do what they will, this is the old Thucydides description of the Melos dialogue. The strong do as they will, the weak do as they must.
I know, thank you. I know you are a diplomat, so you don't want to come down clearly either or in many cases. But when you look at...
Not an either or. It's been taken. The decision is taken. It's
no,
war.
but look at Ukraine and the future of Ukraine and how to overcome the war. You know, you're right regarding the outbreak of war. You know, missed opportunities cannot be dragged back into reality. But what about the future? Would Ukrainian neutrality actually be helpful to overcome the war, or would it actually be very dangerous for the future of Ukraine and the security situation in Europe? What is your impression?
Klaus, this is so hypothetical. There is a war which is boiling, and the whole relationship, not only of Russia and Ukraine, but Russia and NATO, Russia and the US, Ukraine and US, Ukraine and Europe, is being resolved through this boiling war. There is now a very difficult possibility. The windows are very, very narrow, if at all, to discuss how a settlement, how a reconstruction will take place, who is going to pay for the reconstruction. And that will come first, even before neutrality. Remember Austria. The Soviet troops entered Austria, the US troops entered Austria. It took 10 whole years, from 45 to 55, for Austria to adopt a status of neutrality on the basis of Soviet troops withdrawing at the same time as US troops withdrew from Austrian territory, and thus leaving Austria totally neutral without any foreign bases, foreign troops over there. So that is one model. There is no one size fits all again. But look at that. It took 10 whole years, and the reconstruction and the economy coming back after the devastation of the war, and people accepting a leader. You need also a prominent leader who can work with the two sides to implement that kind of status after 10 whole years. So what we are hypothesizing, even in the best of times, I don't know how this marked up war since yesterday night is going to be resolved in the next 10 years. I won't be here. You will.
Hopefully. Thank you. We had that peace conference in Switzerland, which wasn't too successful, but at least some countries talked to each other. Now we are talking again. There are rumors about another peace conference, this time with the participation of Russia and also of China and the United States and many other leading countries. Will Malta, or is Malta doing something to bring such a peace conference about, perhaps on Malta?
Well, at least it is commendable now that instead of having one hand clapping, as the previous peace conferences were, we are moving to having the two hands clapping. So that is very, very salutary, because in a way it was hope against hope with this unilateral peace conference. Where was it going? One can also say that at least it created a ramp to come to the bilateral peace conference that is required. So that is where I think it will be very, very important. Malta is, as always, and I'm not in government at the moment, but Malta is always welcoming this kind of peace conference. And if it were to be bilateral, I'm speaking bilateral as two sides only, but it can be multilateral in that respect, especially if there will be the United Nations Secretary General and his mediation group, because there is a small mediation office in New York in the United Nations building. That is where it will have a role. I think it is a role much more for the United Nations to come in over there, because you want to have whatever is going to be agreed upon in a way guaranteed by the United Nations and by the big powers. You can't have anything just done between the two powers. The EU will have to come in, the US will have to come in, Russia will have to come in, and perhaps some other neighboring states will have to come in also. So that is still up for grabs.
Thank you. One notion of neutrality and non-aligned countries is particularly by the ones who don't like that kind of notion, like often the big countries who like smaller countries to side with them rather being somewhere in the middle. Often the accusation is these countries are sitting on the fence, they're trying to play off both sides. And a good example perhaps for our situation today is India, which is often mentioned in that context. You know, India being quite friendly with many Western countries, including the United States, but also dealing very intensively, particularly in a trade way with Russia, for example. So are these countries really not coming down on either side in order to benefit, not least economically, and playing off the two other sides? How do you see that?
Well, let's start off from basics. Each state promotes its own interests all the time, or most of the time, and there's very little space between most of the time and all of the time. So India, as a founder member of the non-aligned movement, has this in the forma mentis of each diplomat, each Indian diplomat I know, and each policy maker. I remember Indira Gandhi telling me, Alex, you cannot be promoting your own country's interests when we met as a non-aligned group in Delhi after the US-UK attack on Libya in an act of solidarity with Libya. And I was saying, I want to put in a reservation about the limits of our continental shelf, which, if we recognize the Gulf of Sirte of Libya, will bring in the continental shelf into the inner harbor of Valletta, of our capital city. So I had to insist on that for our own national interest. So look at how national interest and solidarity with another country that was illegally bombed by the US-UK, and I wrote in my paper the way that we strenuously applied a non-aggression pact in the Mediterranean at the time. There isn't time here to elaborate on that, but if you circulate my paper, that will be available. And also then I'll come back to how I negotiated with Larry Eagleburger at the time, who had become a close colleague and working partner. He was still in the civil service, then got promoted to Deputy Secretary, Under Secretary for European Affairs, Deputy Secretary of State, and finally also Secretary of State. And with him, I negotiated an exchange of letters between our Prime Minister and President Reagan, where the difficulty that you're mentioning was the first one that he raised. We are not going to support your neutrality. We'd prefer you to be with us and not banging around in the middle and just suiting your own interests. But I said, listen, the previous government in Malta had tried to be a NATO member. It did not succeed, neither as a member, nor as an associate member, nor as an observer. It was rejected. So there is a bad taste left about all this anyway. So we want to go for this neutral status, and NATO countries are supporting us. Italy, France, Germany, Willy Brandt at the time, he used to come to Malta and bring his industrialists here to help us create jobs with German industry investing here, instead of the jobs that were being closed down because of the withdrawal of the British bases from Malta. So we had that internal dilemma about taking on neutrality. But with Reagan, I finally, and through Eagleburger, I finally managed to get this exchange of letters. And in the paper I circulated in Kyoto, I published this Reagan letter, which you have, where President Reagan is accepting that Malta chose its own part of neutrality, welcomed it, recognized it, supported it with economic delegations coming to Malta, opening factories all over again on the Willy Brandt model. So it isn't as if it is anathema, as if it is totally verboten prohibited, that a chief of an alliance sees all the other countries as enemies if they are not inside the alliance. It's impossible. In a world of 194 states, NATO is not going to gobble up all the other 194 states. This is where the mentality becomes too zero-sum. And that is where we need to create space. Similarly, when the Warsaw Pact was there, we used to tell them, you're not going to gobble up everyone else, Cuba, Vietnam, etc. And who else are you going to bring into your Warsaw Pact? There is a whole area, a whole space, physical, geographical space, many states that have been decolonized, that are saying a plague on both your houses. We don't want to be a member of either alliance. We want to just move along. And if we can play you off one against the other, it's because you're so idiotic and so stupid that you're allowing us to do it. And if we manage to do it, good luck to us. You do what you do to us. We do what we can do to you. So look at this as the multipolar paradise that beckons.
Thank you.
Instead of unipolar, which I think is impossible again.
Mm-hmm. You spent a lot of your career during the Cold War. You are well versed, as you displayed here, of Cold War global politics, but now we are clearly in a transition of global politics. Some people wonder whether the era of globalization has really passed and whether we are facing a new era of protectionism and semi-isolationism. What are your insights about where we are going and how we should really manage that transition in world politics? This includes, of course, the important role of China, which is becoming ever clearer, but also of the global South more generally, which, of course, in the past, during the Cold War, played a relatively marginal role. Now it's coming to the forefront ever more. We see that with the BRIC summits, we see that with the G20 even, we see that with many other international conferences. How do you view what is happening in world politics right now? And is there any, well, optimistic advice you can give us, perhaps?
It's not really the moment where one can be very optimistic. But let me start off by comparing with the interwar period between the two world wars. Remember that the increase of tariffs between countries was part of the propulsion towards the Second World War, especially on the Eastern Front with Japan. And so that is why you have immediately after the Second World War, the efforts under the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade got to dismantle tariffs as slowly as could be, removing quotas, removing the non-tariff barriers very gradually, and then with the start of the World Trade Organization after the end of the Cold War, to bring also China in. But what do we have now at the WTO in Geneva? The WTO, in contrast to GATT, had the jewel in the crown with its appellate body on dispute settlement. So it had a vestige of supra-governmentalism in contrast to sheer intergovernmentalism. But now we are facing a consistent veto by the United States on appointing, let's call them judges. They're not judges in the traditional sense, but judges for shorthand. Intriguingly, this didn't start under Trump, although Trump got the full blame for it. It started under Obama. But Obama was much more clever than Trump. He characterized it as personal for the particular person he was vetoing to become a judge, and hinted at conflict of interest. So that was pretty acceptable. Under Trump, it became mechanistic. Any new nomination of a judge was vetoed, one after another. Under Biden, now we've had a whole articulation of the defects of the appellate system, and we're having a total judicial legal review, but yet we don't have the appeal. And so all the cases, you read about cases of the EU against China, China against the US, US against China, China against the EU. All those are only going to the first level of dispute settlement. As soon as the losing party appeals, it goes to nowhere. It goes to the nonosphere, somewhere where this appeals board should be and is not there. So we are inevitably being propelled now into more tariffs. And with Trump's advent, China's preparing the counter tariffs. Even the EU is preparing counter tariffs because it is expecting Trump not only to apply tariffs on China, but even on the EU, as he did in the last term of office. So what are we going to be witnessing? We're going to be witnessing more autarkic economies, less international trade. And perhaps this was the defect of globalization, that globalization took place de facto. It took place like the Dutch East India Company, like the British East India Company, going to India and taking whatever it wanted to. That was globalization. And the de facto globalization that we had in the 80s and 90s did not find a regulatory framework. Now it's going to have a de facto breakdown of globalization with tariff barriers around most of the large trading states, and the global south will have to make do with what they can do. But as you said, the global south is now becoming much, much more relevant. At the recent BRICS meeting in Kazan in Russia, there were 36 countries' heads of government. And the Western press just dismisses this. They were saying there was a conference in Russia without even saying who was there. And I find this censorship is not healthy. The West's censorship of what is happening is making us all less aware of what is really happening and less able to judge what is happening. Because that force is, in any case, developing and growing. And if they have a third of the world's GDP, I think it is something which isn't any longer marginal as the global south was on the immediate decolonization phase in the 60s and 70s. Then yes, it was marginal. And when Algeria was putting forward its new international economic order, it was not given that much resonance. But now the G20 and the BRICS should be getting much more attention. And I think we want to be at the level now. A close friend of mine, Patrick Diamond, analyzed, and this is relevant for this forum, how Brexit, with Britain moving out of the EU, the small states inside the EU lost the shelter of Britain. And so the small states inside the EU were scurrying around to find new balancing, new non-bandwagoning or bandwagoning inside the EU. So this is a microcosm of what's happening in the larger globe. So in the larger globe, you have states, small and medium, scurrying around whether to side with the Western position as enunciated by the White House, because that is not the whole West. And you saw how the votes have been reduced in the UN General Assembly in condemning Russia on its intervention in Ukraine. So even there, the global south slowly but surely, after the first panic rush, started getting more sober and finding its own position and policies.
And can you understand that from a Western point of view, you know, the attack of Russia on Ukraine was so outrageous and so bloody and ruthless that it's unbelievable that any country in the world, including among the global South countries, should intensify their relations with Russia, should not condemn Russia. How do you explain that from a Western point of view? And many Western politicians, I think, really don't understand that. How can it be explained?
Well, I can tell you, when we were organizing in the WTO in Geneva to have a vote of solidarity with Ukraine, there was a reflection which was very commendable, that if the vote didn't come to a sufficiently high number, and there were serious doubts from our lobbying in the corridors that this was going to happen, then Russia would say, you only got, out of 168 members, you only got 60 members, so 100 are with us. You know, the other side of the argument that Solana had used against Russia in attacking Yugoslavia. He had said in the Security Council, Russia tried to stop the attack on Yugoslavia, but only got 3 votes. So he deduced, only by deducing, that he had 12 votes in his favor. No vote was taken. So now look at this way of counting votes for and votes against. Now, I'm not, and I wasn't too sure that the 100 would be pro-Russia. But what if the 100 were non-aligned, that didn't want to take a position? So again, the space, the geographical space for states saying a plague on both your houses, this is your stuff. You are meddling in each other's business. Leave us out of this. We don't want to rally with you, because then once we rally with you, once we're hooked, that is where the trouble comes, because then you'll tell us, buy from us this, buy from us that, do not buy from there. And it's cheaper and better quality from there. So why should we be denying our citizens the possibility of buying something which is better quality and cheaper from somewhere else, just because we hook onto these values and therefore bandwagoning behind one group and not going to the non-aligned center? The non-aligned center, I think, should again be waving its flag as the best place to anchor states' policies.
Thank you. Can I remind our audience that you are free to send in your questions by using the chat function of the Zoom screen. I will ask a few more questions and then we'll reply to some questions. In China, in the United States, China is seen as an existential threat by many. That includes economy, technology, geopolitical relations, and many other factors of great power politics. Therefore, China and the United States are really at loggerheads today. In the last couple of years, we have had perhaps something like a thaw because of efforts of both sides, President Biden and President Xi Jinping. But now with the incoming Trump administration, there's of course a lot of speculation that a new Cold War or something like that, or a very tough period of American politics towards China will be upon us again. How do you see that? What is the role of China in the foreseeable future?
Let us start again from basics. When the Cold War started, perhaps thanks to Kennan's long telegram, and it started 2 years after with NSC-68. But Kennan's telegram really describes it most forcefully. You have 2 ideologically charged groupings of states, because Stalin had created the cordon sanitaire in Poland, East Germany, Romania, Bulgaria, Czechoslovakia, etc. So there were a lot of states with him in the Warsaw Pact. The ideological confrontation pervaded everything, not only social theory, socialist theory, but also the economy, the culture, social policy, even basics of family arrangements. So it was total. Today, I don't think we have this ideological confrontation between the United States and China. I don't think the United States is all there to conquer China. In the Cold War, the idea was that the US would be better off if it conquered the Soviet Union and squashed its ideology and its model economy and society. And the same in the Warsaw Pact, they were totally against the capitalist system, which they wanted to quash. Today, I don't think that China wants to quash the capitalist system in the West, or to quash the social model of the United States. So who benefits from fanning the flames of a dispute which is not ideological, but which might be much more a trading dispute, or if you want to be more precise, a research technological dispute? Who is going to be the more advanced in technology? And as in any competition, commercial competition, no rules. You can trip up your partner, you can hinder him, create obstacles, but that's the name of the game. I don't think that there is much. I don't think that there is much warfare of expansion. The fear during the Cold War was that Russian Soviet tanks would roll across the German plains. That was the physical threat, or the placing of missiles in Cuba, which would have threatened at least Florida, if not mainland America. Now, I don't think China is putting missiles anywhere. On the contrary, the US is arming Taiwan, a part of China, which even Nixon had recognized in his one China policy. So what's all this fanning of flames? Merely for a technological competition? So I think we must boil it down to where the real competition is today. Even the fact that the Soviet Union and Europe and the United States' interest in Europe were geographically close to each other. But now the US and China are not even that close to each other geographically. So where is the immediate threat to US territory or to US trade as such? And therefore, we are coming to a stage where not only the rules-based international order of the UN Charter are breaking down, but also the rules-based trading order. The free market model is crumbling. It's no longer a model to sell. You can't have a free market model and slap tariffs here, there, and everywhere, as Trump did last time and is promising to do again this time. You can't have the two together. It's not a free market model any longer. Although the Inflation Reduction Act of Biden was also heavily criticized by the EU as unfair competition of subsidizing American industry against EU industry. So the free market model, the rules-based international order and security in politics, in economy, in trade is crumbling. What's left of it? We need another Yalta. We need a Yalta too. And that is where I think a big summit might be in the making in the coming years, because by virtue of the fact of all this crumbling and the need for handles again and guardrails, we are going to be requiring a new construct. Guterres tried this with the Summit of the Future, but unfortunately, its timing was directly impacted by the Russian war, illegal war onto Ukraine, and Israel's illegal war also, at least on Lebanon, if not also on Gaza, with 48,000 deaths, which are not being stopped at all through international diplomacy. So this is where.
Yeah. Sorry. So the competition between China and the United States is really an artificial competition which is inflamed by certain forces. Is that what you're saying?
I would say that really there is this technological race, but attributing everything to this technological race, I think, is misplaced. It's not as if whoever is going to master artificial intelligence is going to master the world. We are still in the Cold War mentality of a zero-sum game, of either the capitalist system squashes the communist model, or the communist model squashes the capitalist system. That isn't with us any longer today. In fact, China's economic model since Deng Xiaoping is not precisely the old socialist model that Mao and Zhou Enlai devised and Hua Kuo-feng after. So I think that here we are looking at very easy journalistic scoops of, again, they're with us, they're against us. It's easy to have an enemy. It's much easier even for TV shows, for media to say, they are the enemy, they are taking us over. Where is China taking over the US? And where is the US taking over China? This is not so apparent as it was in the Cold War. There might be a cold atmosphere, yes, if too many tariffs are imposed on China. I think China has already prepared for that with its huge injection now into local government. So instead of moving on so much on the foreign export model, it's moving on the internal demand driven economy. So there is some creation of defaults to fall back on, which will be able to take and buffer the shocks of Trump's new tariffs. And anyhow, have tariffs really worked for the US economy? There are many studies of eminent US economists I know who have shown, and these are very good at quantifying, the inside effect of tariffs, which is much greater on US consumers, both by themselves and with the counter tariffs that come along. So it is not really so commendable, even as an economic policy, although ultimately it seems to be inspired by going back to pre-World War I, before income tax, and this seems to be the main ideology, if you like, in order to replace income tax with revenue from tariffs. That seems to be the underlying economic sense. Mm-hmm. And who suffers most from income tax? So it's mainly to relieve those who pay most income tax by reducing income tax and applying tariffs. But tariffs ultimately feed back onto the consumer. So either the consumer is paying income tax or is paying for higher price goods because of the tariffs and counter tariffs.
But right now we are seeing an increasingly hostile climate between the United States and China. We have a coming trade war, perhaps. We have tension over Taiwan, increasing tension in the South China Sea. We have also human rights tensions and violations. Then, of course, there's China's strong support for Russia in the Ukraine war. And there are many other factors. How can that all be resolved? You sound a little optimistic that perhaps Trump and Xi Jinping will meet each other at a conference and overcome all their difficulties by some sort of mini Yalta conference. Is that what you have in mind?
It depends on what is intended. And perhaps Trump, having a second term, might want a legacy, and might also, he had shown some envy for Obama's Nobel Prize. So he might want that kind of legacy with a prize, instead of just fomenting more tension, which is costly. And anyway, it does not seem that the US is going to subjugate China. Initially, yes, when Trump was elected, the draft, which is unsigned, was like some conquistador demand of China. But this was Navarro and Lighthizer who had penned this conquistador demand. You know what was in that conquistador demand of China? The US even wanted to have influence, if not even representatives, on local village tribunals, right down to the capillary of local village tribunals, because they were alleging that since the Communist Party appointed those judges in the local village tribunals, the US would not get a fair deal if it alleged that there were subsidies from local villages into products which ended up into the American market. So how do they want to control this? By inserting their own persons inside the local villages in China, which was totally rejected by China. So what, going back to pre-Boxer rebellion in China and having the bases all over again, the foreign bases, not American, because America wasn't looking for bases, but there were Russian bases in China, British, French, Spanish, etc. So they knew that, they've passed through that, they don't want that. And I don't think that really the US wants to colonize China, wants to subjugate China. So what do you want out of China? A deal. And Trump, transactional Trump, I think, does not really want to subjugate China, doesn't want to conquer China. So let's drop this black-white mentality. Because if you don't want to conquer China, then you go for another gear and another policy. You see how confusing these two visions are. You either want to have a deal, and so you can have various scenarios of deals. You don't get to a deal. As a lawyer, I have many different parties coming to my office every day. And we try to find which deal will accommodate both or three or four parties. You don't find that immediately. Sometimes it takes weeks. But finally, I stitch up a deal for them. They're all happy and go out and pay me.
Thank you. I like your optimism. Hopefully, you're right. Before we come to the questions, one quick question about the European Union, the future of the European Union. The European Union is, I would say, once again in crisis. Economically, it doesn't look too good. In many countries, particularly the leading countries, there's hardly any economic growth. The German government has just collapsed. Macron's government is also facing dire difficulties. And there are various other factors which are not very optimistically looking for the future. Hungary and its obstinate, stubborn policy, anti-EU policy, for example, comes to mind. So it looks as even the far-right Italian government seems to be among the more sensible governments within the European Union. All this gives cause to concern, I would say. Or what is your interpretation?
Well, there's always been concern. It depends on whether you see the glass as half full or half empty, I suppose. I mean, we're always hearing that it's going to break down and unravel. There might be difficulties, particularly in the financing. I mean, the huge financing for the Ukraine war has created an enormous strain on the EU, which is historical. It has never had such a huge strain. And then with the Nord Stream gas being stopped and buying the LNG from the US at a much higher price, 4 times the price, these are taxes that the EU is suffering not so gladly. So it will take some time to recover. And you have certain plans. The former Italian Prime Minister Draghi's plan on increasing the competitiveness, I think, hits the nail on the head again by going for technology. This is where the new competition lies, by having more technology. It's amazing that all the search engines in the internet field are American, and the EU hasn't managed to foster at least ICT competition, let alone in AI, let alone in technology, which is useful for industry. So Draghi's report is going to be a mantra for the new commission to implement. That is the way forward, I think. And that is where the EU will come through as an able competitor, in spite of the tariffs that Trump promises to impose on also the EU. But the EU will be applying its counter tariffs also on the US. So that's going to be a jolly exchange of tariffs, which will create a lot of extra costs for both sides until they wake up and say, what on earth have we been doing? Just increasing costs to both sides. It's a lose-lose situation. Can we get to either win-lose or win-win?
So a transatlantic trade war, is that what you're predicting?
Well, Trump is promising this, not me.
All right, thank you very much. Let's get some questions in. We have some interesting questions. Perhaps Emma can ask the first question, please.
Yes, we have a comment and question from Frederico Van Vinda, who previously worked at the National Defense Institution think tank. He mentions how Portugal, which sometimes likes to see itself as a small country, is a part of many international agreements, but likes to specify its relation to each signatory bilaterally. Could you speak more on the importance of small states being a part of multilateral institutions, but maintaining their agency, their capacity for individual action, and in the case of Portugal, position as a respected international broker, which is currently helped by Guterres being General Secretary, even if they are NATO aligned?
Yes, I think that this is a very appropriate question. It is looking for the windows of opportunity for mediation, for negotiations. Guterres has tried many a time. And so there you have the world institution where the Secretary General himself has been working. I will also mention a tougher example than merely the world organization itself, the United Nations organization. Look at Turkey, a member of NATO, doing mediation between Russia and the Ukraine. A member of NATO that is at war with Russia. So this, I think, is again on the other model I was mentioning before, when de Gaulle was operating separately from NATO, when Ceausescu was operating separately from the Warsaw Pact, Turkey is operating separately. Has Turkey been reprimanded? Yes, it was originally by Biden, but then he had to see the light and accept Turkey's offer of mediation. First on the grain exports, then on prisoners, one after another of the rounds are salutary and most commendable that Turkey has been doing. So again, by saying that small states, and especially small states that are neutral, have credibility, doesn't mean that other states that are even members of a military alliance do not have credibility and may also carry out mediation. And these are most welcome. We need more and more mediators wherever they come from. So this is why this perspective is not a zero-sum perspective. NATO is here, China and Russia are there, and India is even with them. So India is an enemy. Eliminate India, eliminate China, eliminate Russia. So we'll be by ourselves unipolar all over again. No, this is absurd, idiotic, stupid. And unfortunately, it is the mantra that inspires most journalistic reports, both because of the censorship on what is happening on the ground and what is being said by the other side, but also because this mantra is being pushed, making our youth stupid as to what real international relations are about.
Thank you. After these forceful words, let's have another question by Emmeline.
Okay, we have a question from Albert Carlson, who's asking, what are the major debates within Malta in terms of how the country should conduct itself internationally? Are there forces that are more isolationist versus internationalist, like in larger countries, or are the divides along different lines?
Well, the debate over here is more or less about being more neutral than not, more strictly neutral than merely neutral. And I think that is a bit of a finesse where certain policies of the actual government are being criticized by a group, not by the opposition. The opposition then criticizes certain other policies on immigration, for example. But these are marginal debates, really. They are not that gripping as we had during the Cold War, when you had the present opposition party, the Nationalist Party, saying, we believe in the struggle against communism, and therefore we want to continue granting military bases to NATO and the UK. And the Labour Party saying, no, we want to have freedom from military bases to develop all our land, all our economy, and our people will have all the options. So there you had as big a divide as you had in the ideological confrontation between NATO and the Warsaw Pact.
Thank you. Let's have another question. Emma.
From Devin Goff, he asks, is it likely that challenges of global warming and irregular immigration will force closer international cooperation, or will it simply generate more tension between nations? Will the novel paradigm of the person-to-person digitally connected world prove to be an important factor in this?
Well, I was mentioning before that at COP29, the small island developing states have made a declaration that they are being, they felt they are being abandoned by the majority pushing the main points on the agenda. And that is a great pity, because it is these small island nations that I mentioned before, like the Maldives and a number of other Commonwealth island states, that are immediately threatened with sea level rise. It threatens their economy, it threatens their people, but also, as I mentioned, a country like Bangladesh, which is not a small island, a huge population, but because of its low-lying delta, will be swamped by a mere little bit of sea level rise. And apparently the world is not looking into this any longer. That's being pushed aside because of the financing required in order to be able to achieve this. Now, the second part of the question, that there is much more awareness because of digital connections between persons. Yes, this helps as what we call civil society networking. But does it filter through policy making? I doubt it. Look at how the pollsters all got it wrong about the US presidential elections. What filtered through? All the pollsters I was reading about in the US press and the British press were saying it's neck and neck, neck and neck. Goodness, whose neck? They missed one neck of the woods for another neck of the woods, didn't they? So I'm not too sure that all this digital interpersonal connection is going to filter into policy making as such.
Thank you. Are you worried about the tendency of having these climate conferences last year in the Middle East, also oil-producing country, today in Azerbaijan, also a gas and oil-producing country, which of course has also its own economic interests at heart and not just global climate issues? Is that the right way to go, or are we discrediting these kind of conferences to the general public by doing that?
Not really. I think it creates a conscience among the general public. But as I was saying before, that conscience doesn't necessarily filter through the policymakers. Look at it the other way around. If we had to have the next or the one after the next COP in the United States, and Trump will still be saying, drill, baby, drill, what will the effect be? Will he be affecting civil society, or will civil society be overturning Trump's policy of drill, baby, drill? There is this two-way influencing going on. I think that Trump's drill, baby, drill will win, and not the public policy, the public opinion and civil society filtering through into policy making, unless it manifests itself in the next election in 4 years' time. But who knows what's going to happen then?
So having a country like a Middle Eastern country or Azerbaijan in charge of the COP29 is a good idea or not?
Imagine if it were held in Texas. It's a good idea or not?
Probably.
And especially with Trump saying drill, baby, drill in Alaska and everywhere else. Does it really matter where the conference is taking place? I think, in fact, that in Qatar and in Baku, it helps to have some influence on the policymakers, who have to make some adjustments in their narratives, at least, and in their public statements. Now, what they do with policy, whether it percolates right into policy, I don't know. But if we had to have a COP in Texas, I don't think Trump would change his mind.
Probably not, but I don't think that has yet been mooted as the next COP29. Anyway, let's have another question. Emmeline. Emmeline, please.
We have a question from Serdar Roni Summer. How does the concept of small states change over time? Do small states always stay small, or can a small state develop into a middle power?
Well, the best example that comes to mind is Israel, that has developed from a small state threatened on all sides to now be threatening on all sides. So there you have a good example of a small state developing. Other small states, I'm mentioning the Maldives, are on the verge of extinction with sea level rise. A number of the 1,000 islands will sink, and people will be displaced. And a number of places have already, a number of other small island states have already been trying to figure out where to take their population to the mainland if the sea level rise threatens even houses and job places, factories. So you can get both the crumbling and the expanding.
Thank you. Emma.
We have a question from Ray. Do you have a sense or can give examples of the dynamics of collective small state influence culminating in the critical impact of a single small nation on the issue in question?
I'm not quite sure I got this question.
I think it's getting at whether collective small state influence how that can influence one state ultimately having the decisive impact. When the state itself is very small, but then collectively they
Yeah,
garner
but
maybe.
first of all, where is this collective small state? The group of there are a number of organizations, the Alliance of Small Island States, AOSIS. There are various groupings that meet together of small states, of small island states, even of landlocked small states. So you get the island developing states, island states, landlocked small states, groupings that meet and discuss, exchange views, but it's not an alliance like NATO or the Warsaw Pact was. It's not a military alliance, not a political alliance. It's a meeting place of like-minded and like-threatened states because of sea level rise, mainly, insofar as the island states are concerned. So a collective isn't there. Now, if you want visionaries, Nehru from India used to say that the more states join the non-aligned movement, then they could come to a stage where collectively, when the two big superpowers were in a stalemate, they could be the tipping factor on one side or the tipping factor on another side. But I think that this is pie in the sky. There was never such a collective. I remember arguing with President Tito that if he really wanted and loved the non-aligned movement, he should be supporting an idea I was promoting, that we should institutionalize the non-aligned movement. And he was vehemently against institutionalizing it with a permanent secretariat and staff and research and all that. Why? I used to ask. And finally, I had this debate in front of our prime minister, and my prime minister told me, enough, you've pushed it enough. Tito was saying that if we institutionalize the non-aligned movement, then the Soviets would take over. And that would be the end of the non-aligned movement. Leaving it loose, and that is what I used to criticize, we used to have heads of government summits every 3 years, meet, issue a final communique after night-long negotiations, burning the midnight oil just to erase a word here, put a comma over there, a qualifying clause here, hours on hours, and then you issue a final communique, and it doesn't live for 6 hours, and it's in the dustbin after 6 hours. Without having a mechanism to implement, you couldn't have this non-aligned movement. And that describes the level of collective that the questioner was putting forward. There isn't a collective non-aligned movement, especially not in the level of Nehru's idea of becoming the tipping factor between super dominant powers.
Thank you. We are coming to the end of our allotted time, but I've left the last and best question and most interesting question to the end, hopefully. I was wondering whether you could enlighten us about your expectations, what the world, what the United States, what we are all facing with Donald Trump inauguration in January of next year, when he will be president again for another 4 years. Will it mean, as some journalists have said, as some people fear, will it mean the end of democracy in the United States? Will it mean the end of the rules-based international order? Will it mean lots of other terrible things in global affairs? Or is it all hugely exaggerated? What is your expectation?
I am not, as I've been showing throughout this extended program, I don't think that one is easily convinced that we are at the end of this, end of that, end of that. When Fukuyama came out immediately after the end of the Cold War, that it was the end of history, that was such a huge exaggeration. And Thomas Friedman was writing, the world is now flat. It didn't last long, as I quoted Kagan with his the end of dreams, the return of history. So, well, Trump, I suppose, will try and move and implement his declared policies on the campaign line, but he will be adjusting much more to reality this time around. I don't think it's the end of democracy in the United States, but who am I to judge from Malta? You are a better judge over there, living in North Carolina and working there, whether it is such a looming disaster for democracy all over the United States, or whether there were already defects of democracy which might be enhanced. That perhaps, but that doesn't mean the end of democracy and the end of this and the end of that. No, I'm not that gloomy and pessimistic about the future. There is a guardrail of wanting to deliver the goods, so to speak. If Trump doesn't deliver the goods, it's going to be very difficult for him to move on. And I think he wants.
What are the goods? Which goods is he meant to deliver?
Well, what the people want. If he's going to be denying people what they want, he can't do that for a long time, can he? That is going to be a very, very difficult situation. So it means on the usual indicators, if you like, the jobs, the standard of living, the quality of life. If those are all going to be diminishing, then he's got it bad coming in for him. Whether it's in a democracy or in an autocracy, you can't be pushing that too much. There is a kind of limit on that too.
Are you expecting a more isolationist American foreign policy?
This is what he's declaring. This is what he's declaring in the campaign trail. But I can't foresee what he's going to do after he takes the oath of office. He might come out, let's be very optimistic, he might come out as a very rational being after he takes the oath of office and touches the holy book. But up to now, he's been saying he's not interested in aiding Ukraine against Russia. He's been saying he wants to slap tariffs on China, the EU, and other countries. He's been talking about NATO in an adversarial or antagonistic position. So those are the cues, but these are merely cues, campaign cues. What he does actually in government, and there's been many a slip between the cup and the lip between what parties say in the campaign trail and what they implement once they get into government, because then that is where they will find the hard buttons to push. And he's been there already, so he will have that deja vu, that experience of knowing that pushing a certain policy might not be that easy, pushing a certain policy might not be that easy, so he won't go down that road again. Or he will go down with increased fervor and perhaps get hit with increased impact. But I would think that once bitten, twice shy, again, will color his implementation phase, not the campaign phase. But what is more interesting is how his campaign promises got him the votes. That, I think, is what you should be carrying out research on. Whether he lowers the tone on implementation after the oath of office, how did those promises garner the votes? Those were way, way, way beyond normal, usual campaign promises. And yet they garnered votes across the US, not in one or two states you would say these are Trump land. That is the most remarkable trait of this electoral result. It was right across the whole of the USA, not in one or two states by themselves.
Are you thinking of his announcement on immigration, or what do you have in mind?
All of them, even the tariffs. The workers in Detroit that he got. Now, whether it is Elon Musk's algorithms, which gave him more detailed profiling of how to set Hispanics against Hispanics, Arab Americans against Arab Americans. It happened in Brexit in Britain, that the Polish citizens didn't want more Polish citizens coming in. The Indians who were already in Britain didn't want more Indians coming in. Now, if Elon Musk has taken this and distilled it to a higher density and got them much more set against each other and got the votes at least of the half who are already there, that must have been a good electoral gambit, which by Kamala Harris's advisors did not figure out. I don't know. I mean, you're based there. I'm very, very far away.
Well, it needed Tocqueville in the 19th century to tell the Americans what their system was really like. So we have now you from Malta telling us
Alexis,
what is going on in the United States. Are you not worried by his initial appointments, his nominations he has already announced, and all that talk that he really deserves a third term in office? You think that is just talk or it's meant seriously?
Well, I don't know. Now you're taking me right into the depths of US politics, which I cannot be an Alexis de Tocqueville, although the first four letters are the same as my first four letters. So I hesitate in prophesying what's going to happen in the US internally. I don't know. It's up to your government. And look, there have been many presidents who have tried to go for a third term in different countries. So and they have found different formula. Look at Putin and Medvedev. So they've been there for 25 years, alternating. Who knows what he will do with Vance?
Well, hopefully it doesn't come to
That's one model for him.
This would be rather frightening. Well, it has been a great pleasure. Thank you very much for all your insights. Dr. Alexander Sceberras Trigona, thank you for joining the Krasno Global Event Series here at UNC Chapel Hill. It was a pleasure to hear your insights. You enlightened us about the state of small states in world affairs, about the issues of neutrality and non-aligned states, and many other issues, including, of course, global affairs and the future of the Trump administration and the future of the world, perhaps even. I would also like to thank all our audience. Many of those have stuck with us until the very end. And of course, this program can be seen and watched again on our famous YouTube channel, probably even tonight, certainly by the latest tomorrow. And I would like to urge you, if you have missed a few minutes or so, please watch the entire program again. And we will have more Krasno events in the future in the new semester next year. But for the time being, I would like to thank our special guest today, of course, and our audience and our two Krasno assistants. And I would like to wish you a good night and thank you very much for joining us. Bye-bye.